Welcome, everyone. This is the second session of How Poskim Come to Know Reality with Rabbi Jonathan Ziring. The sources will be shared on the screen, but I'll also put them in the chat. And with that, I'll turn this to you, Rabbi Ziring.
Thank you, Evie. It's good to see everyone again. So last week we began our journey into figuring out how Poskim come to know reality. And just to review what we saw last week was we noted that the complexity that faces a Poskim is that every halachic question includes both the theoretical law and the application to reality. And while poskim may be experts, like that's their job, that's their definition in the halachic theory, in Talmudic analysis and understanding how to weigh independent analysis and precedent and custom and the like. In order for it to become real, it needs to be applied. And that requires a tremendous amount of knowledge of whatever the field is that's in question. So if it's a medical question, they need to incorporate medical data. If it's the inner workings of a dishwasher, then they need to understand the inner workings of a dishwasher. But poskim don't necessarily know how to do that. I promised last week, but I didn't get a chance to do it. So now maybe just to, as part of review, I'll pull this up. I mentioned that I have a graphic I use that I made years ago just to summarize the entire the halachic process. Let's see if this will actually work. Yeah, I'll pull it up just for a second. I didn't send it out, but I'll just share on the screen for a second. So right, this is my graphic of how psak works. And very quickly, right, we start with the three things that I think that poskim take into account to figure out the normal psak. One is the independent analysis of canonical sources, meaning what does the Gemara say, and the like. Then they look at precedent, right, which is what did previous poskim say, what did previous authorities say, what is the custom, right, what do people actually do? And once you have those three, so depending on how poskim weigh those, they come up with the most plausible psak. Now, as was mentioned last week, there is also, it's really that's the most plausible psak. But then if there are extenuating circumstances, then we move to the legitimacy of less plausible psak. And here I have a list of different things that count as pressure in the halachic system, monetary laws, kavanah brio, chilul Hashem, etc. And then they can apply. But as I note here on the right-hand side, the application is not always so easy because, and this is what we're trying to figure out, the complexity of applying psak to reality. And as we noted last week, it's not even clear if the job of poskim is to determine reality. And that's where we had really picked up last week. And we set up different models. So to remind you of the models, we had the model from Yoma, which is what we call the outsourcing model. That sometimes poskim say, listen, I know that the question of whether someone is allowed or has to eat on Yom Kippur is a medical question. The halachic question is very simple. If someone's life is in danger or might be in danger, so then that overrides Yom Kippur. The question is whether their life is actually in danger. And the Mishnah says we turn either to the doctor or to the patient. And if you take that model and extrapolate, so one way that poskim come to relate to reality is outsourcing, right? They say someone else is going to determine the reality on the ground, but presumably that reality is then incorporated into the psak. That was model one. Model two was the complete abdication model, the claim that the assessment of reality really, under at least in some cases, lies outside the purview of psak, period. And the case that points in that direction is the case in Yevamot, the sunset case. That if the rabbis say the sun has set, Shabbat is over, and people go and they rely on that, and it turns out that it was just cloudy and the sun comes out, so they are held personally liable. They can't hide behind the halachic ruling, which implies, even more radically than Yoma, that in certain cases at least, reality is outside the realm of psak entirely. That was model 2. At the other extreme, we noted there's a series of passages in the Gemara, which the Rambam summarizes in Sanhedrin, which tells us that judges have to know outside knowledge. They have to know a little bit of medicine and a little bit of the laws of avodah zarah, and a little about the laws of witchcraft. And the reason is because they need to be able to weigh in halachically. But that implies they need independent expertise. And again, some of these are surprising, right? How often did the Sanhedrin were they actually faced with questions of magic? I don't know, but they have to be prepared in case they get a magic question. Idolatry, I assume they did get questions about this. To give you an example, though, of what it means for someone to really be an expert on this, let's say on avodah zarah, this is an example I often give to my students because it was so striking in my memory. Years ago, when I was an undergraduate, so one Shabbat in YU, they had, I think maybe it was the first Shabbat of the year, so they had a big Shabbat with many of the faculty, and they had a panel, and on the panel at some point was my teacher, Michael Rosenzweig, and the dean of Bernard Revel Graduate School, the Graduate School of Jewish Studies, Dr. David Berger. Now both Rosenzweig and Dr. Berger are tremendous Talmidei Chachamim. They both have PhDs in medieval Jewish history, but Rosenzweig's day job is that he is a Rosh Yeshiva. And Dr. Berger's day job is that he's the dean of the graduate school, and his focus is his doctorate was on polemics between Jews and Christians in the Middle Ages. So his expertise is often the intersection of Judaism and other religions. And during this question and answer, someone posed the question to them, and he said that he had a coworker who is a devout Hindu, I believe, and therefore religiously a vegan, and they had baked a cake for this coworker, and they didn't realize when they baked the cake that their religion demanded veganism. They thought it was vegetarianism, so they included eggs in the cake. And now the cake has already been eaten, and they asked, what should I do now that I've already given the cake? Do I have to go and tell the person that there were eggs in the cake? So Rosenzweig, who, as I said, his day job is Rosh Yeshiva, said something to the effect of, listen, I'm sure that she'll appreciate that you were trying to be nice for her birthday, and honesty is so important, and she'll see your integrity, and it'll be a Kiddush Hashem, and you should tell her and explain what happened. Dr. Berger interjected, and he said, look, I understand what you're saying. It just happens to be that you don't understand the inner workings of Hinduism. And again, I'm not an expert, so I could be getting this a little bit wrong, but he said, if in fact this coworker is devout, so a breach of the veganism, even by accident, would require tshuva, would require repentance. And one of the parts of repentance requires an actual ritual act to an idol. And there's a biblical prohibition of Shem Elohim Acherim Lo Yisham Al Picha. You're not allowed to do an act that will cause somebody else to engage in idolatry. So if you tell the person post facto that they violated their veganism and they're really devout, so you are the direct cause of idolatry. So you're not allowed to tell them because it will cause idol worship. Now, in this case, it's very clear that Rav Rosenzweig, who is a tremendous Talmid Chacham, because he's not familiar, as I'm not, with the inner workings of other religions, he didn't even think that this could be a problem. And it was only because Dr. Berger already was expert enough in this that he was able to weigh in. That's the type of thing the Rambam is talking about here, that you need to know a little bit of everything. But that's a very, very high bar, right? That contrasts very much with the Yoma model and the Yevamot model with the Yom Kippur model and the sunset model, which both imply that reality is not under the purview of Poskim. And the last thing we saw last week was the possibility of what we call the translation model, right? Which is that maybe Poskim don't have to be independent experts, but just like the Gemara says, that a member of the Sanhedrin needs to know a language well enough to understand what the litigants are saying, but not enough to necessarily speak, because they can't have the information mediated through an outside source. So it could be that the way poskim need to know outside facts is at least enough that they are not at the whims of the mediator. So those were the models that we set up last week. What I want to do today is set up one more model and also flesh out what some of these models might look like in their extreme. So let's start with the final model. Then I'll open up for questions. Then we'll push into the model. So here, okay, I'll pull up 1 second. Pull up the Gemara and Evie also shared the sources if you want to look on your own computer in the chat. So the final model I want to explore is this model that emerges from Sanhedrin. The Gemara in Sanhedrin tells you as follows. The context is rabbis getting permission to issue halachic rulings. So Gemara says that Kiavinachet Rav leBavel. When Rav went to Bavel, Amar leila Rabbi Chia l'Rebbe ben Achoto. Yored leBavel, Yore, Yadin, Yatir Becharod al Yatir. So Rabbi Chia said to Yehuda Nasi, my nephew is going to Bavel. Before he goes, he would like permission to issue halachic rulings. Is he allowed to issue rulings on ritual law? The Talmud. So he says, yes, I will let him issue rulings on ritual law. Yadin, can he weigh in on monetary law? Said Yadin, he can. Yatir Bichorot. Is he allowed to weigh in, as we mentioned last week, on the permissibility of a firstborn given to a Kohen to be slaughtered not as a karban, not as a sacrifice, which requires that it got a certain type of blemish, a permanent blemish? Is he allowed to weigh in on that? And he doesn't give him, Yehuda Nasi does not give him permission. So then the Gemara says, we'll skip a few lines. He said, why is he called the son of my brother, etc.? Wasn't he the son of his sister also? And he says, yeah, it was like, he married people who were themselves related through half marriage, whatever. Not going to get into it. Skipping down to 4 lines here, right? The Gemara says, Yatir Becharot al Yatir. Why didn't he, in the end of the day, tell him that he was allowed to weigh in on blemishes? Ilema mishum de lo chakim. If it's because he thought he wasn't smart enough, he didn't know the laws of mumin. Ha'ka'amrinan de chakim tuva. We know he was smart. He was really, really smart. So Gemara says, fine, it can't be that he's not intelligent. Ella mishum de lo bakiye b'mumeh. It must be that he felt that Rav, while he was Torah smart, he didn't know the reality. He didn't grow up with animals. He didn't know what blemishes were permanent and what blemishes were temporary. He couldn't identify them. Gemara says that can't be it either. V'amar Rav shmona asar chadashim gidalti etzel roeh behema lida ezomum kavua ve'ezomum over. Rav said, I spent 18 months living with a shepherd in order to know what blemishes were permanent and what blemishes were temporary. So you can't say that Rav wasn't an expert. He was an expert in the Torah, and he was an expert in the reality. So why wouldn't he grant him the right to issue rulings? So Gemara says 2 possibilities. One, one is that Rabba Bar Chana was already allowed to weigh in on these, and he didn't want to impinge on the honor of Rabbi Bar Chana by allowing another person to enter with that authority. Possibility one. Vi ba'irema mishum hagufe the Rav bekia b'mumei tvei. And then the Gemara says something surprising, and it says, no, you know what? Maybe the reason that they didn't let Rav weigh in on blemish cases was because he was too much of an expert. V'sharei mumei lo yade inshe, and he would end up permitting blemishes that people wouldn't understand what was going on. They wouldn't realize why this blemish was transient and temporary, and a different one was permanent. And they'll end up expanding his ruling mistakenly. Va'amri, and they'll end up saying, Ki agavna shari Rav vatu lemishrei mom over. They will, because Rav was such an expert that he saw the slightest nuances, and therefore he might end up saying, this is permitted, this is forbidden. This is permitted, and people will say, oh, I once saw Rav permit this type of blemish, and they won't understand that the blemish they're looking at looks like that blemish 99%, but is just different enough that it's actually not permitted. And therefore, because he was too much of an expert, they didn't give him the right to poskim. So I'm going to unshare the screen for a second. What is this model, right? So again, the Gemara has a person here who has expertise, both in the halacha, in the theory, and in the practice. He understands the details apparently better than anybody else. So the Gemara says, so why doesn't he get the right to poskim? And the Gemara gives two possibilities. Again, one is out of deference to Rabbi Bar Chana, or he was too much of an expert. He was too much of an expert. Okay, so what does this Gemara tell us about how poskim come to know reality? Right, this is the new Gemara. So what does it tell us? What does this add to our conversation? What does it tell us about how much of an expert poskim need to be to weigh in on reality? Yeah. You can just shout out, Anne. I see your hand. Go.
It has to be replicable, in a sense of it. You can't. He was too expert. Nobody could follow in his footsteps. They wouldn't.
Okay, and therefore,
good.
So and therefore,
they would try to use it, and it would lead to mistakes.
Okay, good. So one possible read, and this is, to be fair, how many of the Rishonim take it, is exactly what Anne said. Anne says, listen, there's a technical problem here. It's a technical problem, which is that it's great that Rav knew so much, but there's a danger that in general, when we issue halachic rulings, we have to worry not just about the local case, where admittedly Rav was the most qualified person to weigh in. We have to worry about the system, right? Because, and I'll add here to Anne, part of being a good posek is being a communicator, being someone who can articulate what you're doing. And if you can't do that for whatever reason, right, either because you're a bad communicator or you're just too expert so no one understands you, so you might be a great theoretical posek, but sometimes we just need to limit what you do. Now, support for that actually comes from the continuation of the Gemara. So if we look just for a second at the next line, the Gemara introduces exactly this factor that of communication. That communication is important. So the Gemara says, Yore, Igama Rishuta, Lama Lila Mishkal. Why is it that people need to get permission to poskin at all? If they know the law, they know the law. Why do they need permission? Gemara says, because there was once a story. Titania Pam Achar Halach Rebbe Lamakom Echad. Vira'a Bnei Adam Shemegablini Soteim Betuma. Rebbe once went somewhere and he saw people kneading their dough in impurity. Amar lahem Ibnei Matem Megablini Soteichem Betuma. Why are you doing that? Because it's problematic. Because when you knead dough, you need to separate challah, and challah needs to be separated in purity. So the fact that they were kneading their bread in impurity was a problem. Amru lo, and they said, Talmud echad balakan v'haralanu mei bitzayim ein machshirin. Who made Beitzim Darshluv in Savar made Bitzayim Kamar. He said there was once a rabbi or once a student who came here and told me that water from swamps made Bitzayim does not make food susceptible to impurity. So as long as we use swamp water, our bread is not susceptible to tumah. But he didn't say that. He said made Beitzim, eggs, right? The liquid of eggs is not one of the 7 liquids. In order for something to be susceptible for tumah, it needs to be in contact with one of the 7 liquids, which are yayin, wine, dam, blood, shemen, oil, chalav, milk, tal, which is dew, dvash, which is honey, or mayim, which is water. Now, swamp water is water, so it makes something susceptible to tumah. Eggs, if there's no water, it's just eggs, it would not be susceptible to tumah. And because they got confused, so what did the rabbis learn from this? That not everyone who knows Torah knows how to communicate, right? And therefore they said, before you start poskening, you need to get permission. But amazingly, the Gemara says the primary reason that you need permission is because psak is about more than knowing the right halacha. It's about making sure that other people know what you just said. So, and suggest that the problem here is that it's great that Rav knew everything, but if apparently he was such an expert that they would create a communication problem, and since part of being a posek is being someone who can communicate, sometimes people who are too expert can't communicate, and therefore they didn't want to give him permission. Now, I will add, so what does that tell us about, in general, whether it's good or bad to be an expert in the reality upon which you're posketing? In general, I would say, what would you think? I'd say, good, right? Like, expertise is good. It's just that some people know their field so much that they forget that other people don't know their field as well. But in principle, it's fine. But here, and this is one of the in the book that I'm co-writing with Ray Clapper, there are times when we write in the same voice, and sometimes our independent voices we are explicit about. So this is one of the points where Ray Clapper's voice is explicit. Ray Clapper has a different read of this Gemara, and he says, no. It's more than that. It's not just that, right? Because the way I'm reading it is that, in principle, it's a good thing for poskim to know reality. If they happen to be such experts that they don't know how to communicate, so then we have an ancillary problem. Just like in the first answer, that the reason Rav couldn't poskin was because of politics, right? Out of honor for Rabbah. But Ray Clapper said, no, there's a fundamental problem here, which is that if the posek knows so much, not just about the halacha, right? Not just about the halacha, but about the reality. It shifts the dynamic in psak into a very unhealthy place. Because let's just play this out. If let's say the Yoma case, right? Even if you have the biggest rabbi in the world, he knows the halacha really well. As long as he needs to talk to a doctor, so someone else is part of the process, right? There's someone else involved. And even if you have, the greatest doctor in the world, but if he's going to weigh in on a halachic question, so he needs a rabbi involved. But when you have one person who knows everything, so he says, I'm looking at his formulation of what we have, which is that it creates a chilling effect that occurs when law becomes incomprehensible, right? We want lay people to be able to reason about halacha and apply the precedents they've seen. making expertise about facts a part of the legal process means making the law inaccessible to people of ordinary knowledge, intelligence, or experience, right? So Clapper sees in this a fundamental problem, which is that we actually don't want poskim who can claim that they know everything, the halacha and the reality, because then their psak becomes inaccessible to everybody, to the laity, and also to his colleagues, because no one can answer him, right? He is the expert, and he'll say, and the problem is that nobody, no matter how smart they are, is not prone to making mistakes ever, right? Right. If you remember Good Will Hunting, right? There's that scene where the math professor is explaining the problem, right? He says, "Listen, there are 5 people in the world who understand what you're doing, but there's only about he said there's only like 5 people in the world who understand what you're doing, and even know how much better you are than I am, right? Like there's a certain level of expertise where you're like leaps and bounds, and people can't even assess your expertise, and you just end up impervious to critique, comment, anything." So Ray Clapper looks at this Gemara and actually derives a new model, right? That even though the Gemara tells as a story someone who became an expert, which implies at first glance, and this is parenthetically how Rav Lichtenstein takes it, that a posek should be an expert, or ideally should become proficient, right? Clapper says, no, the Gemara here is a warning that we don't want poskim to be such experts that they become not understandable to the lay community or to other experts, because then that is a bad dynamic for halacha. So if we now add this model to what we saw last week, right? Last week we said either poskim are allowed to outsource, they are just not authorities over reality, or they should be experts, or maybe they should at least be experts to the point where they don't have to have mediated information. But now we're opening another possibility, which is maybe we actually like poskim being proficient, but not so proficient that they feel or actually are impervious to critique by their colleagues or the laity, because that creates an unhealthy dynamic in halacha. So that is model 5 or 4 if you count. Yes, Atara.
Hi. Hi. So I was wondering, how do you then think of the example where I don't remember who it was, maybe Rabbi Akiva, who was the only person who was able to discern between the colors in Nida, if it was tameh or not tameh.
Right, so that's the thing,
And
is
I
they're
think it
definitely
said there that it's because it was too difficult for anyone else to do it, but he knew the way of looking at it.
right. So Rav Lichtenstein really goes in that direction. He notes that if you look through Shas, the Gemara says, to give a very common example, we follow Shmuel in monetary law because he was the expert in monetary law. Like, the Gemara clearly does recognize that certain people were just better at certain disciplines, and apparently that was okay. Now, it's true, they weren't necessarily so much better, right? That no one could speak to them and no one could understand them. But yes, at some level, you do have to acknowledge there are places in Shas that point in the direction of people being experts in ways that other people weren't, and that apparently is okay. Could it be that no one was quite at the point where, again, Bechora was to begin with a very, very narrow discipline? It's possible, right? It's possible. But look, this, like I said, this is one of the places in the book where we have a tension, where I err more on Rav Lichtenstein's read, which is that this Gemara is more technical, and it's actually showing that ideally poskim should develop proficiency, but sometimes that's not enough for the reasons that Anne said, right? That communication is also important. Roy Clapper takes this as a more fundamental read, which is no, we don't want them to be the rabbi and posek. But I tend to agree with you that there is some tension with other
Well, because
places.
in the example that I brought, it's not just a matter of having one person be have expertise in a certain area. It's also the ability for a man and a woman to be together. In other words, they listened to his psak, and had they not had him, then they might have had to continue to
Yeah, no,
count them.
I agree with you that in some of the Gemarot in Nida around Rabbi Akiva, the Gemara actually goes out of its way to express how surprising the psakim of Rabbi Akiva. I would just add, though, in defense of Rabbi Clapper, the end of all those passages in the Gemara is that the students challenge Rabbi Akiva and he defends himself, which means that even if he was really, really, really an expert, he wasn't an expert to the point where there wasn't a conversation, right? All those Gemara are very dramatic because they turn to Rabbi Akiva in shock and he says, "Why are you so surprised?" And he explains what he did, right? So it could be that the only thing that we don't want, right? I don't think this made it into the book, but right, Clapper's example we were talking was we don't want the posek who also is the Nobel Prize winner. Like, it's a very narrow thing. Like, you don't want someone who can just look at everybody and say, "I know better than you." Because Rabbi Akiva, even if he did know better, is forced to respond. And that might be enough to create accountability. Okay, I see JJ. JJ, you're raising your hand. Jojo.
Yes.
Why do you put your first name? I know you as Jojo. Maza. How you doing,
I know
Jojo?
it defaults. Unfortunately, I'm not
I'm sorry.
in a place where I turn the camera on, but hopefully next week you can actually see me. But so this is very interesting. My question is, so first, I've only ever, I guess I haven't encountered this specific Gemara because I only ever had seen, Rav spending 18 months as a good thing. Like, if you read many of the commentaries on it, it says, no, it's a good thing to develop proficiency, and rabbis actually need to develop proficiency. So that was more of a comment. The question is there a difference within this reading between sort of direct poskim and then poskim for poskim? In other words, can someone develop such expertise that it's not shaykh for them to be directly advising the kahal, but you become someone who's the Rosh Yeshiva who the other rabbis are going to come to ask, and can you teach them? Is that considered like a different type of halachic?
So I'm open to that. Meaning, I think even Ray Clapper would be open to that. Meaning, as long as there is some accountability, right, that someone can have the conversation. I mean, descriptively, there are a lot of people like that, right? There are people who are such experts that they end up being the rabbi's rabbi on a topic, and no one else really talks to them because they just get the really, really, really hard questions, right? So, like, in Israel, a lot of the really complex fertility questions and some needed questions will end up at, let's say, Machon Pua, where they have, people who've developed very significant expertise. And to be fair, I don't know if we'll get, depending on the pacing, I don't know if we'll get to it here, but there's been a tremendous amount of there's been a significant amount of sociological work on what Machon Pua has created, and what that shows about the dynamics of the power dynamics between poskim and doctors and women and all of that. Very fascinating work done here in Israel. So there are things like that. There are all these subspecialties. You saw it, without weighing in on these particular issues, right? You saw it during COVID, where for many people, Rabbi Aaron Glad, being both a rabbi and an infectious disease specialist, made it that he was essentially the final word on a lot of things for many people, because he had that synthesis. I mean, he doesn't fit the model you're talking about, because he's actually very accessible and he's like a shul rabbi and he knows how to talk to people and the like. So he's less of a good example. But in terms of him being like the final word for rabbis, he ended up taking that role. And whether you think that dynamic is good or not comes down to a lot of these sources. So I'm not in principle closed to it. But I think what Ray Clapper would say is that even if you do that, you need it to be that someone holds that expert accountable, right? Someone can talk to them. It doesn't have to be that everyone can, right? Not everyone understands everything, but it needs to be that someone, right? Someone can hold them accountable. But yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that there are people that are only accountable to other experts. That's often how things work. Right? The same way as in medicine, right? There are many people who, will get second and third opinions, and they'll ask their GP to basically mediate between them and the expert, right? Like they don't understand, they don't understand the details of the different, whatever, cardiologist opinions or something like that. But they'll ask their GP, can you at least explain to me what these experts are saying and help me make a decision among the experts of the experts, right? I don't think that model is crazy. So yeah, I think short answer or long answer, yeah, I think that is definitely a possibility, even within this model. Okay. Other questions, or should we see the exact opposite? The exact opposite extreme. Okay, let's see the exact opposite. So this is, right, Clapper's suggestion of why we don't want Poskim to be the Nobel Prize winner and the posek. But as we noted in the Rambam, when the Rambam says that you need to know some medicine, some whatever, there's a large range of what some might mean. Some could mean 10%, and some could mean 99%. There are a series of poskim, I gave you just one, like Reb Chaim David HaLevi, who say what we learn from that Gemara is the exact opposite. We want poskim to be such experts that ideally they don't have to talk to anybody. They know it all themselves. So if you look here, this is the Reb Chaim David HaLevi's commentary on the Rambam, Dvar HaMishpat, and he writes as follows: we need the people who sit in judgment to know themselves the primary branches of knowledge. Our Torah is amazing. The Rambam said they need a little bit. What does a little mean? They need to know the basis of all knowledge. So they never need the testimony of experts. So something got messed up here. He says, why? Because experts might be experts, but the key word is it's very hard to get them. Mishulalot, nitiot, shenalot, b'kanei echad. It's very hard to get people who are not biased in ways that might not work with the Torah's values of justice. And therefore, our judges, so the people who are appointed as Sanhedrin need to know the basis of science, modern science, that all the complexity of reality will put before them. Whether they're poskim or they're judges. And this is so true nowadays. Modern authorities need to deal with all these complex modern issues. And they often need professional advice, and they can't always rely on the experts. And sometimes experts contradict each other. And how often, therefore, is halacha decided incorrectly? Because the person asked didn't know what was going on. And therefore, knowledge of the basics of wisdom in our time is desirable and perhaps necessary. And God should give us the merit of bringing back our judges and our original advisors, and the world will be filled with the wisdom of God like water covers the sea, right? So here we have the literal exact opposite. That now, right, we noted that in the Rambam and Sanhedrin, one could come to the conclusion that you need to be an independent expert. But we didn't say how much of an expert. Chaim David Levi comes in and says, when I say expert, I mean expert. I mean expert. And why? Two reasons. Because you never know who's biased, and often there's disputes even amongst experts. And therefore, the posek needs to be such an expert that he can resolve disputes amongst the experts. Right? So now we have someone coming in and saying, no, you don't understand. When we say poskim need to be experts, we mean experts. I mean, like, in everything at the top of the field, period. Right? I didn't give you this source, but a very striking version, the probably most striking version of this, is that the Gemara, and it's the Rambam rules this way as well, describes the smallest size city that would have a court, and it has 100. It's a 120 person city, and the Gemara lists who are the people in this idyllic minimal city. And one line in the Gemara is Rofe, and then the next word is either Uman or Vi'uman, right? So Rofe is a doctor, and then the next word is either Uman, which is usually means bloodletter, right? Though it can also mean expert. But the Vav really matters, right? The Vav really matters. Why does it matter? Because if it has a Vav, then it means that every city needs a doctor, and in their time they thought that bloodletting was also medically helpful, so you need a bloodletter too. But the Merkevet Mishnah, and then later Rav Kafach, say no. And Rabbi Runovich says as well that the proper text is Rofe Uman, a surgeon, essentially. The Taj Beit says a surgeon. And the Merkevet Mishnah says, why would you say that a city that has a court only needs a surgeon? Why don't you say it needs a doctor? And his answer is, because if there's a court, they already know how to be doctors. Because that's what it means to be a judge, is to be a doctor. They don't have to be surgeons. Okay, we draw the line somewhere. That miktzat means they don't have to be heart surgeons, they don't have to be brain surgeons, but they have to be doctors. They have to be diagnosticians, but they don't have to be surgeons, right? Now, that is a really, really extreme view, which says when we say poskim have to be independent, we mean like independent to avoid disputes and to avoid bias. Okay. From Chaim David Levi, yes, I see responses coming, as I'm not surprised. Yes, Atara, go.
So maybe maybe to add on that, not only to have all the knowledge, because it's important to be an expert to make the decisions and to be machriya between two people that don't agree, two doctors that don't agree, but also if you're a posek, then you want the flexibility, right? With all the knowledge in your hand, you want to have that flexibility to be able to give the less machmir necessarily, machmir psak. And you can only do that if you're really knowledgeable in the field and you understand the halacha, but you also understand the reality.
Okay, so I was going to ask, before Atara made her comment, I was going to ask the following question, but now you've answered one, which is, who thinks that this is a positive thing? So Atara says there is a positive thing here, that if the posek is an expert in the halacha and the reality, they can actually be more responsive to situations because they have all the factors, right? They're not constrained by anything. And that is really good, because often what constrains poskim is that they're parts of the picture they don't have, right? So, and this model is adopted. It's not just Chaim David Levi. It's Chaim David Levi. It's Rav Uziel. It's in certain places. Rav Kafach. It's multiple poskim go in this direction. And as Atara says, yeah, one of the benefits is simply that it gives them flexibility. I will. Okay, I'm not going to weigh in yet. I want to hear other people's comments. I don't want to bias it yet. Anyone have a different take of what do you feel about Chaim David Levi? Okay, so, oh, Deborah, yeah.
So it seems like it's super unrealistic to the point where you kind of need a messianist fervor to believe that this could happen. Like,
So unrealistic, I think, is definitely true. I don't know if you need the messianist fervor. It's true that in this piece he has it. I'm trying to think if that's part of his general worldview. I'm not sure. He's not usually. He's like, he's a very down-to-earth posek in general. But sure, there is a little bit of messiness fervor here. Yeah,
the number of people with that level of expertise in that number of fields, even if you don't care what fields they are, the people with that expertise in that number of different fields on planet Earth is not enough to staff all of the court system that the Mishnah describes.
It's not enough. I don't think it's enough to staff a beit din of 3, but that's
that also could be. Yeah.
I mean, it depends how many things. So I agree, right? So there's the good. So Atara says there are advantages to it. Deborah notes maybe there are advantages, but it might not be realistic. Okay, I see Anne raised her hand also. Yeah, Anne.
So I was thinking along those lines too. Does that mean you should only give a psak on something that you have at least a minimum level of, or whatever we say the minimum level is, which is more than the original model?
Good. So I think that Chaim David Levi would probably say yes, meaning if you take Deborah's critique seriously, which I think we all have to, probably Chaim David Levi is presenting an ideal in his mind. I don't think he actually thinks that anybody is quite at that level, but it is the strongest way he could say that nobody should be weighing in if they don't know what they're talking about independently, right? I would say that he probably does believe that. That, or at the very least, that when we need to outsource, that is a real disadvantage in the way we think about psak. I think that's definitely true. Now, I'm debating here whether to get to the next source. You know what? I think because this is very theoretical, let me give you a concrete example. And if we get to the next source next week, it's not the biggest deal. Let me give you an example where I think there's an advantage to it, and not the advantage that Atara said. I think there's another advantage as well. I think Atara is also right. I would add that the benefit of Chaim David Levi is that it also gives Poskim confidence, and that's also important. And the example I use, but we're not going to do it in detail, but because we have 10 minutes, is the history of smoking in halacha. Okay, I'm going to do this very quickly. Several hundred years ago, when the questions first came in halacha about smoking, most of the questions were about whether you could smoke on Yom Tov, right? Because on Yom Tov you can do certain things. You can light fires for certain purposes. And many of the early poskim said, following the medical advice of their time, that you are allowed to smoke on Yom Tov because it's healthy. That was what you have like 300 years ago, right? Because that was what they thought. You have this in the Chayadam, you have it in the Yotzenaibshitz. Obviously, mid-20th century, the questions emerge again, both whether you can smoke on Yom Tov and whether you can smoke at all. Let's say mid-20th century, before all the studies came out, all those poskim who, let's say, are not of the Chaim David Levi camp, all basically said in the 50s that smoking was permitted because it was still understood to be at least neutral. Then research started to emerge, right? Research started to emerge that this was not the case. Smoking is bad for you, okay? You find a very interesting phenomenon. All the poskim who are not obsessed with being independent experts, they did eventually come round to opposing smoking, but it took a long time. It took a long time. Now, why did it take a long time? Presumably because the way their mind worked was, if smoking is dangerous, then it is prohibited. But they were following the Yoma model. They were outsourcing that to doctors. And therefore, what did they have in front of them? They had the knowledge that they had in, let's say, the 50s that said that smoking was fine, it was safe. And then slowly but surely emerging voices that were opposed. Now, if you're outsourcing the knowledge, then right, you're not claiming any expertise. It's going to take you a very long time to be convinced that the reality is different than when you started. Because how am I supposed to know? Interestingly, Reb Chaim David HaLevi is the first posek that I can find who comes out and says, what is wrong with you people? Read the new research that's coming out. Smoking is dangerous. It's usser. And I think that it's a function of the way he thinks about psak, right? Is that if you feel that the job of a posek is to become an expert, then if you see new research coming out, for Chaim David HaLevi, you don't wait for a consensus to emerge. You go and you read the new papers and you say, is this compelling? And if it's compelling, you take the confidence and you say, we were wrong, there's new information, right? And I think, right, so on the one hand, there's a real danger to Chaim David HaLevi because A, as Deborah notes, it's unreasonable, right? Not everyone can reach that level of expertise. Following Rabbi Clapper's model, it might make Poskim completely non-accessible. But on the other hand, a posek who feels that it's their job to really understand what's going on is going to feel responsible to do research and constantly be on top of the newest information and getting the best knowledge, because when you outsource it, Yoma style, you don't feel responsible in the same way. You say, listen, I'm just a rabbi. How am I supposed to understand what's going on with doctors? If you think that it's your job to become an expert, then you will feel responsible. And when you feel like you've gotten the expertise, you'll have the confidence to weigh in. So what I want to highlight here, and this is the reason I'm giving this practical example, is because I want you to understand this isn't just theory, right? The question of whether a posek says, I'm comfortable outsourcing, on the one hand, it expresses humility. But on the other hand, as the Torah notes, it might take away flexibility. And I would add, it might take away their confidence to weigh in when a decision needs to be made. Whereas claiming expertise, on the one hand, might not be realistic. It might entail hubris. But on the other hand, it might give the posek the confidence to make decisions when they need to be made and to make decisions that other people aren't willing to make. So the question of whether a posek thinks that he is personally responsible for the reality or is comfortable outsourcing it is going to completely change the way he interacts with the reality. I see Richard wants to come in. Go, Richard, go. The floor is yours.
I think the smoking case though raises two other really huge issues for how to Poskim. First of all, my experience, much more limited, is that one area where halakha has a lot of trouble is weighing risk. And so smoking is not absolutely, I'm not encouraging smoking at all. I don't do it. I would never tell anybody to do it. But the reality is smoking it's on a spectrum of how much risk there is. It's not going to kill you right away. And so how do you weigh that risk? Driving, right? Huge risk, and yet we sort of allow it. So how does halakha weigh when that risk tips over? Is, I think, again, an area of expertise, but also an area very hard for halakha because it doesn't seem to have a good way to measure it. And then the other thing is society. I remember in a separate case when there was all this scandal around immigrant labor and poor wages in the kashrut business, in the processing of the meat. And one of the responses I heard from some rabbis was, look, the public authorities, the federal authorities, whatever, have said that these places, if they meet the labor laws, that's good enough, and it's not our job to second guess where society is on these issues. And that becomes a really hard question. And again, I'm not advocating one way or another about how kashrut firms should treat their employees or whatever, but it seems like a model where you say the rabbis have absolute power on this is going to be really hard, and a model where, as you say, where you take expertise could be a model where you take expertise could be really hard too.
Good. So the first thing that you say, okay, I say I have 3 minutes. So let me make a very important point, which we'll see how much we get to unpack of this. But what Richard says is, I think, very important, which is, even if, let's say, you don't accept the radical view of Chaim David HaLevi, and this is a point that Rabbi Dr. Judah Goldberg has made to me many times. He made it once or twice in writing, but I've heard it from him in person many times. We had a long conversation about it, is that at the very least, one of the big problems you have to acknowledge in modern psak is that traditional psak discussed medical evidence in anecdotal form, right? Like they say things like, a medicine works if it worked 3 times for somebody. And modern medical data is statistical. And Poskim
They say that
don't know
about
what
amulets, right? It's amulets.
What?
At amulets.
Yeah,
that
exactly.
work.
They said about amulets.
And referring
And
to his
Poskim don't really know what to do with that. And I agree with Richard that I think a plausible argument can be made that even if a posek doesn't want to be an expert, going back to our translation case, they do need to know statistics. They need to understand what base rates are. If a posek doesn't know what a base rate is, then they don't even know the language that the experts are talking to them in. So I would completely say that even if you don't accept Chaim David HaLevi, the translation model that we talked about would demand that poskim know the basics of statistics to even know what doctors are saying when they say risk, because they don't mean what the Gemara said when it said risk. They mean risk in a very particular way, with a certain epistemic model, and if you don't understand it, you literally aren't speaking the same mathematical language. So, and I make this point we make this point in the book, that even if you don't accept Chaim David HaLevi, the translation model requires poskim to know statistics, and I agree with you that many don't, and that's a real problem, because they literally don't even know what they're hearing. Your second point is well taken, which is that it's also really complex. Yes, and things are really hard. Yes. Okay, I see that I have 30 seconds. So I got through 2 sources, but we established very important models here. I will say that there is so much that I want to talk about. The rest of this source sheet, which I guess we'll start with next week, is the question of whether whether what we're just talking about is the same for Sanhedrin and modern psak, or is modern psak different? I want to get to some cases that are a little less theoretical. We threw out some now with smoking and the like. One of the things I definitely don't want to do is to at least, and it may be that we'll do this much more, less in depth. I want to highlight a few examples of the complexity, and I want to introduce something that Richard had brought up last week. What about issues where it's not just that they're complex, but that it's very hard to pull apart ideology, right? It's not bias, like ideology and facts, like psychology, right? We're Freudian psychology for sure, right? The line between medicine and ideology was very hard. And what do poskim do with things like that? Because that's really important for the history of mental health and halacha. And I want to at least give a 20-minute introduction of how that works. I have many examples, but that example I think is particularly important. We're not going to get through everything, but I hope by the end to have done enough theory and shown a few examples to at least highlight the issues. But I don't want to keep you over time. So next week we'll continue with this, and I'll think of which examples I think are key enough to at least get our feet wet in what this looks like in practice.
Is the idea of risks that was brought up here, wouldn't that be covered by safek and sfek-sveka?
Partially, yes. Partially, yes. That's safek and sfek-sveka. But even there, you need to be able to translate the language of svekot into the way that modern medicine works, which is not a direct one-to-one correlation, right? Like sfek-sveka is notorious because it doesn't seem to work mathematically. right? Now Rabinovich tries in his dissertation, which was on statistics in the Talmud at U of T, to explain mathematically why it works. But he, in the end of the day, moves away from a purely mathematical model to more philosophical models, because it's not clear that there was so what you're saying just adds a level of complexity, which is that yes, halacha has discussions of safek and sveka, but you also need to be somewhat like last year I made a point when I taught sveka to my students to show different mathematical suggestions of what it actually means in terms of modern statistics, both from Rabinovich and from Professor Moshe Capel, who both have mathematical models. Because I do want them to understand that they are mathematical, but even that is really, really complicated. So you're not wrong, but it highlights Richard's point that assessing it in the modern framework where the way we just think about numbers is different is itself very complex. Again, it's not that it's not doable, but that in order to do it well, Poskim need to know a lot of mathematics. And to be fair, most of them don't even begin to be proficient. Some do. Rabinovich did, right? Rabinovich, I would trust to Poskim Sveikot questions, because But the question is, do we demand that? That's really the question, right? I would trust Rabinovich with Sveikot questions, but do I demand someone having written a PhD in applied mathematics at U of T to do that?
But
Okay.
it also shows that the rabbinics did consider that idea, like
Yes,
that
for sure,
that
for
they
sure.
were aware of it, in terms of
They
their
were aware,
psak.
correct.
Right.
They were aware of it, but not necessarily. But being able to translate that into the way modern medicine thinks about it is important, right? It's not that it doesn't. It's just you have to be able to speak two languages, right?
Right.
Jojo.
Fluently, yes.
Yes. Two mathematical
Just
languages.
to clarify the last point that you were discussing, it's fair to say that we follow the rove for the halacha, but not the mitziyut?
So that's not clear, right? In general, there's a machloket. The Ramban in Sanhedrin Lamed Bet or Lamed Gimel quotes a machloket between him and the Gonim, whether by reality we follow rove or we follow expertise. So it's not actually clear, and we're not going to get to it in this series. But the Ramban and the Torah Adam and the Beit Yosef seems to paskin this way, and several modern poskim explicitly think that no, we actually don't follow rove or expertise. We follow local doctors just like we would with Moradatra. That is the simple read of the Beit Yosef in Tafresh Yudchet. And Reb Zilberstein in Shabbaton, in his book on Yom Kippur, explicitly says that we preference local doctors because of Moradatra. But the short answer is it's not clear that by medicine we go by rove. We might go by rove, we might go by expertise, or we might go by other models, and that's a meta machloket that poskim have to answer, right? So what you raise is a very important point, which is in addition to assessing the mitziyut, you have to weigh in on meta questions about what counts as mitziyut, right? There's both the figuring out the data, and then there's meta rules about that, and that adds a level of complexity. Now that though is at least a halachic question, right? The questions of standards is a halachic question. The questions of application is a reality question. But yes, that question is really, really important to answer. And again, some poskim have thought about it. I named a few who did, who have explicit modern discussions about this. Not all poskim have even spelled it out in their mind. And again, to maybe we'll come back to this next week, but again, let me just go back to the Yom Kippur example because it's such an easy example, right? There are poskim I know who take the outsourcing model, which basically would look like, send me your doctor and I will poskin for you based on your doctor. Other poskim I know take the rove model, as you're suggesting, and say, ask me the question and I'll ask 3 doctors that I trust and I'll get you rove. I know one posik, that's how he poskins. He gets his own 3 doctors and gets rove. The question of even, right, so you see that the way you apply these models is very important, right? If you take an outsourcing model, you're more likely to tell the patient, I trust you to pick a doctor, and then I'll follow the psak according to the medicine that they present. If you follow the more posek's responsible, then you have to start talking about Rove and say, I will figure out Rove and things like that. So those are different models that exist. Okay. Yeah. If you want, remember, by the way, general announcement. You can always, we won't get through everything. So my email is in the top of every source sheet. You can email me, and some of you have my email anyways, because I've known you from before. You can email me at that email or an email you have from me, and I will happy to continue or send you sources on any issue we talk about.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Ziring, and thank you to everyone who joined us and is always participating in our learning community. We will continue next week. Thanks again, Rabbi Ziring, and lehitraot.